Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. In today's episode, we're going to talk about why our own development cycles have been longer this year, address the reasons that players often think that developers slow down over time, and discuss some of the hardest lessons we've learned as we approach 2 years of doing this full time. Now let's get seedy.
Today's question didn't come from any specific player or member of our community, but it is a question we've been asking ourselves and have talked about a lot behind the scenes the last few months, which is why has development of both of our games slowed down this year? So settle in with a beverage and buckle up because we have a lot to say, and this is going to be a long one. So for some context, I started working on this business full-time in 2021. The game Prince of Suburbia had been in part-time development and kind of, was abandoned for a short period, came back. So it was just kind of languishing from 2017 until 2021, which is when I started working on this business full-time. And I don't remember how many releases we had in 2021. We also did a rewrite of the game and we were working on A Shot in the Dark already. And I do know we did not have any profit that year because at that point, all funds from Patreon were reinvested into the game. 2022 was our first year with both of us working on this full time. And we had 7 releases between both games. We had 4 releases for Prince of Suburbia and 3 releases for A Shot in the Dark. And during that time, we did all of the content creation for both of the games, except for the 2D art. We had an outside artist that did the 2D art, and we actually switched artists in 2022 in order to be able to speed up the development cycle. But all of the coding, all of the 3D art, all of the writing for most of the year was done by us. And our intention in 2023 was to expand our team and to be able to go even faster. But as we're wrapping up this year, we can look back and see that we are on track to have only 5 releases or maybe only 4. We have 3 releases for Prince Suburbia that have already been released, and we've had 1 for A Shot in the Dark, and we'll see if we get a second one out this year, but we have a lot to do with the Steam release, so it's not quite clear exactly if we'll be able to get those done at the same time. We're on track to have approximately 1 less release for both of the games this year. The past few months, we've been kind of thinking about that, like, why is that? Because it feels like we've been working harder than ever. We're certainly not working any less hard than we were last year or any less hours. The updates that we've been releasing this year are slightly longer than the updates from last year. However, that certainly does not explain the difference in the number of releases. So let's get into why we think this happened.
So one thing to address first, we do see a lot of players, especially those who are fans of one game and not the other, who typically complain about the fact that we work on 2 games. And, from my perspective, it's understandable in the sense of, like, if they don't care about the other game, why would they want us to work on the other game? The answer is they wouldn't. That being said, working on 2 games, as you would imagine, does make things go slower than otherwise if you were to just be working on one game. And that's a fact, especially like when you have to take care of bug reports and various other things on both games, and you have to switch your mindset whenever you're developing on both of the games. It can definitely take more time on that. Another reality, though, is that there's a lot of times, like when you're working on these different games, especially since we were not the artists for the 2D game, there are points where there's nothing really much we could do anyways on Prince of Suburbia, for example. So there would be efficiency saved, essentially, when we work on A Shot in the Dark, with that extra time. So there is some of that gained on that end. Another thing where we gain efficiencies and make the games more robust is by nature of having 2 games, especially when we've put both games on Steam, or at least A Shot in the Dark will release soon, is that we've learned a lot of lessons for how to make things happen with Prince of Suburbia first, including achievements, just setting up the store pages, setting up the builds, the beta testing builds, all that stuff. All that is knowledge gained from the first game, and we make our mistakes with that one, and we improve and become more efficient for the next game, whereas this would have been time that would have been sucked up anyways if we were only developing one game and just working on that. So like with anything else, as you continue to develop these games, you're going to gain those skills, gain that knowledge, and you're just going to be faster in those types of things.
Yeah, and I mean, I look at our numbers and I think about if we were only doing Prince Suburbia, we still would have only probably had 3 releases this year because that's how long it takes for the art to get made. And if we had only been working on A Shot in the Dark, maybe we would have had, a guaranteed 2 releases and be well into our 3rd. I don't think that we would have necessarily gotten 3 whole releases of A Shot in the Dark out this year. The reality is that when you have one person doing each aspect of the content creation, you can only go so fast. And so, because we have 2 people, we are able to work on some things at the same time, but, you can't like put renders in a game that aren't made yet. And there's just certain things that can't happen until something else has already happened. And so you do have periods sometimes where you're waiting on something to happen, or, you're waiting for renders to render or whatever. And having two games allows you to better utilize that time, like you said. And also, I think it has helped us avoid burnout because they are two very different games. And so, whenever I'm feeling sick of one, I can go work on the other, and then I come back to the first one refreshed. And so I do think that working on two games has helped us avoid burnout in that way. And the reality that a lot of players probably just don't even truly realize, so let us be really frank about it, is that there is no development of A Shot in the Dark without Prince of Suburbia, because Prince of Suburbia paid for A Shot in the Dark, both in terms of allowing us to do this full time. And so we have the actual time to develop A Shot in the Dark, and in actual funds that we've invested into making A Shot in the Dark. We spent about $80,000 this year on, paying outside people and companies to do things. We've probably spent about $100,000 this year on development of both games. And, we can't necessarily tease out how much was spent on either game, but we don't have that money without Prince Suburbia. A Shot in the Dark on its own, because it's still relatively early in development, would probably only have a handful of patrons. A Shot in the Dark is not on Steam yet, and it wouldn't be ready for Steam until this point. So there's no putting it on Steam any earlier. So that's just the, harsh facts of life, which is that, not only did we want to finish our commitment to our fans by finishing Prince of Suburbia, there was no making a second game without finishing Prince of Suburbia. And so I know a lot of fans see it as kind of like our inferior game because it was the first game. And so it's not as polished and not as complex as A Shot in the Dark. But, it's still a high quality game on its own. It still has a very loyal fan base. And, it has enabled us to do this full time. And there's just no game development, and there's no Vim Studios at all without Prince of Suburbia. And the reality is that A Shot in the Dark is going to fund our next game, because that's how game development works. I know a lot of players look at Patreon, and that's typically a lot of players' metric for how well a studio or a creator is doing. But the reality is that for us, Patreon has never been the end goal and has never been what we thought would financially sustain our studio. We always knew from the very beginning that it would be Steam. And even now, with a successful finished game and another game, halfway through development, Patreon is still only 10 to 20% of our revenue. So certainly there's no incentive for us to stretch out development or try to use Patreon in order to fund ourselves. The incentive for us has always been to get content made as quickly as possible so that we can get it on Steam, because that's what funds our business, and that's what allows us to do this. This industry really isn't that different than the indie game industry in that way, in that games can't really fund themselves when they're in development. You need some startup funds in order to fund development. A few select creators are able to make it work with just Patreon and fund themselves while they're developing, but that's becoming increasingly rare in our industry, and it's certainly not something that we've never counted on. So, for us, it's always been about the previous game funding the next game.
And then to cut in real quick, one thing that Jocelyn mentioned is if it wasn't for Prince of Suburbia, funding A Shot in the Dark, things could have been very different. And honestly, they would have slowed development down even more. And the reason for that is most likely I would have had to go back to a W-2 job, and we would have had to develop A Shot in the Dark on, like, Jocelyn still could have been full-time, but I would have been a part-time basis. So the delays would have been there. And to be honest, we were just simply fortunate that Prince of Suburbia became such a success like it did. And that helped us maintain our full-time efforts on these games. So some good news, our main goals for 2023 are on track to be accomplished, and those goals are getting the 1.0 release of Prince of Suburbia out on Patreon and Subscribestar, which is already out there right now, and then we're hoping to release that update in November or December to itch and Steam, and it's such a milestone, and with having the main story completed, the GUI updated, it just feels really good, and like I said before, being able to focus on one project, it's going to be nice, and allow ourselves some breathing room, because it's been us, heads down under the water for quite some time now. And then the other goal is to get a paid product of A Shot in the Dark on Steam in early access this December. We're not quite there yet, but we think we're going to hit it. So aside from anything else that might come up to prevent that, we think we're going to be able to make it, and that's going to feel really good too. So our current plan for A Shot in the Dark on Steam, the paid product, is going to be Chapter 3 early access, and then we're hoping to add Chapter 4 in early 2024. And the translations, they may or may not come with a release on launch, but if they don't, then they'll come very shortly after.
So the bad news is that some of our smaller goals for this year are probably not going to happen. We hoped to already be further along with Prince of Suburbia, like epilogue content or pregnancy DLC or whatever ends up coming after Prince of Suburbia 1.0. And that's going to be definitely pushed into 2024, since our goals right now are just to finish with the 1.0 release of Prince of Suburbia, get Prince of Suburbia out of early access on Steam, and get into whatever you call that, full release or whatever. And, that will probably happen early next year. And then we'll be able to focus on more content for that game. We didn't have chapter 4 ready for Steam release. It's just, we aren't there yet, so anything could happen, but mathematically, it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. At one point, I think we thought we might even have chapter 5 ready for Steam release, which, like, what were we thinking? But also, too, that was back when we had planned like smaller but more frequent releases. So I guess what's really going to happen is that chapter 4 is kind of like chapter 4 and 5 combined, and that's why it's coming a little bit later. Yeah, our smaller goals for the year didn't really work out, so that's the bad news.
Yeah, it's absolutely like crazy to think about, but this also harkens back to one of our previous episodes where we mentioned originally the goal, at least what I was spitballing. So it was so silly, like thinking about it today. I was spitballing and saying, oh yeah, we'll release every month on A Shot in the Dark.
Right.
That way we'll keep fans interested. There's no way in hell that would be possible, especially with all the features and all the work that has to go in the chapter updates today.
Yeah, I think back then it was like we were just looking at solely renders. And yeah, like technically I can pose, 20 to sometimes even 100 renders if the posing is not like a huge like difference between each render. And then the renders render like overnight or while we're working on other things. So like in theory, we could have gotten 1,000 renders out a month. I mean, that's technically possible, but that's assuming that all I'm doing is renders and no writing. And like you said, no special features in the coding, like just slapping it right into RenPy, and certainly no like additional stuff like translation or walkthrough features or any promotion or marketing or any, like, that's the thing, is that we just didn't have a deep understanding of how many other tasks were involved, because with Prince of Suburbia, we were not trying to run it as a full-time business at that point. So, we weren't doing necessarily all the things that needed to be done. So we just didn't know until we were doing it.
And that leads into what I'm about to talk to you about next, which is the Prince of Suburbia Part 2 paid DLC release, which happened in December 2022. As we talked about it ended up being a surprising success. And honestly, that has led to a lot of time invested in keeping things up to date on Steam. And a lot of those things include translations, Steam achievements, bug reports from the discussion boards, Discord, reviews. Like, it is time consuming to have to go through reviews, especially the ones that are like in a different language, and find people being like, oh, there's a bug. How do I play part 2? And it's like, this happens all the time. And if you don't answer that, those positive reviews could turn to negative, and you have to be able to help the community. And, one solution to that might be suggested, like, oh, well, get a community manager then to handle that. And
we'll get to that.
Yeah, that sounds great in theory, but it's not for sure thing that's going to fix your issues. Some more stuff that was time invested on Steam is, just in general answering questions that fans have in the community forums or in news event posts, that kind of thing. Another thing is, when Steam reviews your games, they can be very picky when it comes to graphical assets, technical things. Another thing that kind of sucks is, like, you can't really opt out of the forum, like the community boards on Steam. And that means that you are responsible for moderating it, because Steam doesn't have employees that are going through the forums. So that's just another thing that's added to your list. With Prince of Suburbia wrapping up, having A Shot in the Dark on Steam is probably going to have, be taking its place as far as the workload goes. Not to say that Prince of Suburbia is going to go away entirely. We're hoping it'll reduce some. But I guess if it stays the way that it is, that's a good sign, because it's going to continue to be successful if that's the case then. But translation and coding will be much more work than it was for Prince of Suburbia. That being said, it's going to be nice that we're only focusing on A Shot in the Dark for the foreseeable future until we end up starting development on a third game, whenever that comes in the future.
Yeah, and I think we never could have anticipated, because we just didn't know how much having a successful game on Steam was going to add to our workload. Of course, now we can go into it with eyes wide open with A Shot in the Dark, which is why we know that even though we're wrapping up the main development on Prince of Suburbia, and although we might do pregnancy or epilogue content, we certainly don't plan to develop Prince of Suburbia at the same pace that we were developing it before. The focus is mainly going to be on A Shot in the Dark. Just to give people an idea of the difference in scale of audience, both of our games, Prince of Suburbia and A Shot in the Dark, rank consistently in the top like 50 to 100 selling games on itch. Prince of Suburbia is almost always in the top 50, and A Shot in the Dark is always in the top 100. And so that tells you that we have very much saturated the audience on itch. And even then, we have maybe a collective like 100,000 downloads on itch between both of our games, and that includes a free demo. And we've been on itch since 2017. For Steam, Prince of Suburbia has been on there for a couple of years. A Shot in the Dark has had a demo up there for like 6 months. And on Steam, we have, I think we're pushing 800,000 downloads on Steam. As far as patrons go, I think we've had over the years maybe like 5,000 or 10,000 unique patrons. So we don't know necessarily how many downloads that amounts to, but just tells you the difference in scale in terms of the amount of people that are looking at our game on Steam and therefore interacting with it. And and then of course too, the added element of a lot more of them are from other countries, don't speak English. So yeah, they're posting bug reports in the reviews instead of using the discussion forum where we would see it more easily. And so all of these things just add up to an immense amount of time. And yes, in theory, we would love to hire a community manager to handle this. And we will get more into, the challenges that we faced in doing something like that. So, this all kind of started with putting Prince of Suburbia on having a paid product on Steam in December 2022. We did not anticipate how successful it was going to be. It blew our projections out of the water as far as earnings. The amount of money that we thought we might earn in the lifetime of Prince of Suburbia on Steam, I think we reached that number like in the first month or two or 3 months maybe. Obviously, it tapers off quickly after that, so it didn't maintain that level, but certainly it made a lot more money than we were anticipating. And of course, we are, as people who actually are not greedy and we want to use that money to reinvest, I think it really put the pressure on this year to how can we use this money to reinvest in the game, and how can we use this money to make development better and faster. And I do think we learned a lot about how we can use the money that we've earned to make the development better and have higher quality games. But unfortunately, we did not find a way to make development go faster. And our attempts, I think, kind of slowed down development. And that's what we want to get more in detail about. And the reality is that based on our experience this year, I am not sure that there's a way that we can use money to speed up development. And I just don't even know that that's possible. And I think we kind of hoped we would be an exception to the rule, because if you look around at the other studios that are making adult games that have multiple people working on them, like large teams, they're bringing in more money than we are and have, upwards of 20 team members sometimes, but their development isn't actually dramatically faster than ours. Oftentimes their games are, yes, more complex or higher quality, but the reality is they're also not developing that much faster than us. So I think that we kind of knew that was a possibility, but of course you always hope you're going to be the exception, or that you're going to be unique in some way, or you're going to be able to do things better or differently than some other people. But, we'll get into more how it kind of went for us this year, using that money to hire people out in order to speed up development. And, the reality is too, in hindsight, we reached a financial goal that was more of like a 3-year goal for us. And it's kind of stupid in hindsight to think that just because we reached that milestone financially, that we were somehow going to cram 3 years of development or 3 years of scaling into 1 year. Like that also was just not going to be possible. And I think we got maybe a little overly ambitious, and that was part of the problem as well.
We definitely got overly ambitious on that end, and we'll talk about it more too. But I will say, something that has been a boon is by hiring some of the stuff up, it has definitely made our games more polished and better, even if it is going to make development take longer. And ultimately, when you have a final product that's going to be better and more accessible and all that for the players out there, that's the goal. So in my opinion, it taking a little bit longer isn't really that big of a deal, even though it sucks for the players who want the next new content out as soon as possible.
For sure.
So for more context, as a studio, we've been hiring stuff out to, people in the industry since 2017. And, back then it was essentially the artist and the programmer. I didn't have enough time to, be coding. So essentially, I was doing more of a project management. This is what I want, please execute kind of role. And, it's been a struggle ever since. It's not a perfect process. It never will be. We're all human beings, and every human being needs a different management type style to succeed, essentially. And the honest truth is we are not perfect either, and we can't provide that management style. We only have one that works for us, and that's more laissez-faire. And if people can't thrive underneath that, typically it ends up not working out. So for more context, in the past, we went through multiple programmers on Prince of Suburbia before eventually in 2022, I ended up taking over the coding work because the previous programmers didn't pan out for whatever reason. Honestly, it ended up being a boon because we had the management over that. We were the ones who ultimately decided, okay, we're going to do this, because you would just crank it out if you needed it. You wouldn't have to be like, hey, what's going on? Where's the update? So with the two programmers that were coding before me, the reasons why it wasn't working out is one of them wasn't meeting deadlines. And then the one after that, it seemed like it was going to work out, but they wanted to use, in my opinion, an inferior visual novel engine. And they were working on it. And then I don't know what happened. I do know that there were bugs with it. And, maybe it was a situation where they didn't want to tell me when we were so close to needing a release, hey, I'm not going to be able to deliver. So it was very much a situation where they ended up ghosting us. And I was like, well, shit, what do we do now?
And those were the only two programmers that worked on Prince of Suburbia. You had more than two.
Well, the way that it worked out is the one who was trying to use the inferior visual novel engine was the one who originally started on the project.
Oh, right. They came back. That's right.
They came back. And, I was excited about it because for the most part, it was a pleasure to work with them. It was just a very odd circumstance to end the way that it did. But, life happens. Who knows what happened to them? Just like with anybody that we hire, we wish them the best no matter what ends up happening with the working relationship that we have. And, as I mentioned earlier, we've worked with multiple artists and animators. And, it can be a struggle, like working with an outside artist or animator, because a lot of the creative control is outside of our power. Ultimately, what it boils down to with that kind of stuff is we look at whatever like finished illustrations or animations there are, and we can just say what we're not happy with or what we want to, be adjusted, and then hope that it works out for the best. But eventually, just like with anything in this industry, at some point you have to call it good. You can't seek perfection because you have to keep developing and getting content out there.
Right. And who would want to work for a micromanager, right? So that's part of it too, is that if we hire professionals that, we have to let them be professional and do what they think is best and, not ruin our working relationship, because when you're working with an outside artist, you hopefully are going to be working with them for many years because you don't want to change artists or art styles mid-project. And so, you want to maintain a good working relationship and maintain goodwill. It's, I don't want to use the word like sacrifice per se, but certainly you have to choose your priorities, right? And of course, one of our priorities has always been maintaining the working relationship over necessarily like imposing 100% of what our vision is, because what kind of working relationship would that be if we were always just like, do it exactly the way we want it and you have no say in it? Like, what artist would work under those conditions? Like, nobody would. But that does mean that, then we are having to compromise, I guess would be a better word, like what our vision is or how much feedback we want to give and how much we really want to push on doing things differently, because, they're their own person with their own opinions and their own vision. Yeah,
typically with Prince Suburbia, for the artists and the animators that have been in there for the history, I try to limit myself to only asking for one or two adjustments. And then the things that like bothered me the most or that I think need to be improved the most, and then leave it at that. There've certainly been player comments in the past, and we still get them today. Comments like, I wish they stayed with Scarlet Ann. Like, Scarlet Ann has the best art. We agree that she is a great artist, and we would never say anything otherwise. The reason why we had to move on, as we've said in the past, is it just seemed like she was simply too busy with other projects. And, that's fine. We were low on the totem pole. We were just part-time effort. So if I were her, I wouldn't focus on us either. It wasn't the best decision for her ROI speaking. So it just necessitated in our minds that we had to move on in order to make good on what we wanted to deliver to our fans. Some more comments are like, why didn't all the art for part 1 get remastered? There's even some art in part 2 that wasn't fully remastered. And the reason for that is as simple as our artist just wasn't interested in continuing with the remastering. So that it was a non-starter, and we just had to, come to grips with that and move on. Another aspect is that people in this industry certainly have their own preferences when it comes to kinks, fetishes, etc. And it can be hard sometimes to hire the right people who either align with the kinks and fetishes of those games or these games, or they're okay with those fetishes and kinks of the games. It's not a mandatory thing to have this, but it sure as hell helps. And, it makes you feel better, certainly, when you do have people that are aligned with those kinks, because it really helps polish the game and get out better content than there would have been otherwise. If we, just a quick little tangent here is, like, we had a writer that was very aligned with the kinks in Prince of Suburbia. And when I read the scenes, I was like, damn, this is good.
Yeah.
And I was so excited to work with them. And I felt like they were excited to work with us too, but then life happened and they disappeared. Mm-hmm. And I was so disappointed.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense too, right? Like, of course, people are sometimes willing to do things that are not like their personal preference because they don't have like a hard limit against it. But certainly it's not going to have that same spark of passion than if they were super interested in it. Or sometimes, like you're working against, like they have a particular preference that doesn't align with the game that they try to insert into the game. And then you're having to, like you were saying, pick one or two things to focus on as far as asking for adjustments. And so you're always asking for the same thing to be adjusted. And, that's something that we've dealt with over the years with both writers and with 2D artists is, they're their own human beings. And just because they're getting paid to do something does not mean that they are just worker robots who will do exactly as we instruct, as we don't want them to. We want them to be human beings with their own, perspective on things. But it just adds an additional layer of communication and sometimes conflict when it comes to trying to get content created. anticipated.
And along with this kind of stuff, at some point as another issue, I believe that there's people in the industry, probably pretty common, that end up, getting tired or burnt out on working on the same projects or same company for so much time. Like, Prince of Suburbia has been in development since 2017. If somebody had stuck with us the entire way, I would not have been surprised if at year 3 they're like, you know what, I think it's time for me to move on. I've been with this for a long time, and that's a fair response. Like Jocelyn was saying, we don't expect anybody to be robots and to pump out everything to our specs, you know what I'm saying? And certainly, if they want to leave, they're free to leave. It's just, as business owners, it can be a headache to try to replace them, especially if there's somebody who's providing a lot of contribution to the project. And, also a part of this is, it's hard to maintain passion working for other people rather than yourself in most cases. There's companies out there that, have this mission statement and do these things that people really believe in and they think they're making a difference in the world. So those are kind of like the unicorn, quote unquote, companies in my mind. But I would say, generally speaking, yeah, I would assume for most people, unless the project is 100% aligned with what they would make anyways, that they're not going to have as much passion unless they were working for themselves. And one of the hardest parts, I would say, from a business owner's perspective, is recognizing when this point has been reached with people that you've hired out to do things for you and taking the necessary steps to part ways after that. It's extremely taxing on both parties, I would say. And on an interpersonal and emotional level, anytime we have to go through this, it pains me so much, and it makes me really question, like, how much do we really want to hire people to do these things for us, with how much time, emotional investment, and all that goes into this. Mm-hmm. It's quite the battle. I still think there's obviously a net positive in hiring things out. That being said, it's a struggle.
Right. Yeah, I think, and I didn't know this either until I was on the business owner side of it, but there's kind of this idea of like, okay, well, if you have money, you hire people to do things. And yes, that sometimes requires a little bit more work. But when it works out, it's great. And I think what we didn't anticipate is that the emotional investment and the emotional, like how emotionally taxing it can be, doesn't even really depend on like how positive or negative the experience was. Like, it's just as sad to have somebody who was like you said, a huge contributor and was doing an awesome job, to just have them disappear on us or quit or whatever. Like, of course, we still wish the best for them and we're happy for them and we are appreciative of the contribution that they made. But that's still like a person that you were emotionally invested in that now is no longer around and you have to try to replace. And that's just something that, yeah, it's hard to maybe explain like how much that really takes a toll on us and how it like really can bring morale down for like days or weeks whenever we have either to let somebody go or we have somebody leave. And, it doesn't really matter the circumstance. Like, anytime we have to end a working relationship, like, you have to mourn that relationship. And that's, like, there's so much turnover in this industry that we're doing it so often that I think that really wore on us more than we anticipated, because we just didn't know until we did it. We've never been on this side of things to understand how invested you get in things as the person that's on the business owner side.
And one other thing I'll say about this too is, with the fans that come in and ask us to be a part of the project as well, and just the team members in general who are happy working together, I kind of paint this in a similar light to when I worked on that team in the past. Doing other type of work where I was so invested personally and emotionally on my other team members on the team that it literally felt like a piece of my soul was leaving anytime one of my team members was leaving the project for good. And it hurt so bad. And, each time I went through that process, I was so hopeful that they would just change their mind and be like, no, I'm going to stick around. And I'm like, yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah. That's kind of the dilemma of it is like, we could have people that were more robotic and we just paid and they did things and it was just like an easy transaction, but then that's not super enjoyable to work for either. Or you can have people that you really enjoy working with. And then, when it's not working out or even when it is and they want to do something else, whatever the case is, like we've had every single type of circumstance over the past 2 years, as far as positive, negative, how things have ended. And none of them have been any easier than any others. It's always just as hard. And, certainly I think that's something that, one of the reasons we wanted to start this podcast was to be able to be a little bit more vulnerable about some of the like emotional things that go into this. Like, it's not just business for us. There definitely is an emotional investment in it. And anytime you have an emotional investment, like the risk of getting your heart broken is there, and it happens. And that's just the price you pay, For all the same reasons we just talked about, we never even attempted to hire out 3D art. In fact, I would say if it really came down to it, you and I both prefer 2D art, but as far as aesthetics, but neither of us are 2D artists. And so, one of the things that we realized is if we were going to start a new game after Prince of Suburbia, like we already had one game where we were relying on outside artists, and we did not want to have a second game at the same time where we were doing that, because there is a lot of time that's invested into managing an outside artist. So we knew that if we were going to have another game at the same time, that we had to be in control of the art. So in the future, maybe we'll do games where we hire out more of the art, but certainly never with two games at the same time. That would just be too much to manage. So we knew that we had to make a game where we were mainly in control of the art, and that's why we chose 3D, was because we could learn how to do it and do it ourselves. So we never really attempted to hire it out. But just as far as people who are looking at other developers and wondering why they don't hire out their 3D art, we certainly can see why it would not be a great idea even if you wanted to. One of the big issues is that DAZ is pretty much the best program to use for making 3D art in this industry, because it has the pre-made assets, and in particular the not safe for work assets that you need. And if you were to try to port those assets to another engine like Blender, you lose a lot of time and you lose a lot of functionality. So it's a huge trade-off to use a different program, even though the programs might be superior. So, that's one of them, is that there's just not that many people that want to work in DAZ. Most people want to work in Blender. It's hard enough to find people in the first place. There's a lot of people that are really good at using DAZ to make special renders, where they're making like a handful of renders a week for people on Patreon or whatever the case might be. That's just not the same like skill set and mindset as people who are making a game in which you need to be able to make hundreds of renders potentially a week, and they're not necessarily all going to be like special render quality. And to be able to like sacrifice that quality is something that a lot of artists just don't have in them. Anybody that has the skill set and the mindset to pump out like hundreds of renders a week is somebody who's already making their own game, because that's where they honed that skill set and mindset. So you're just not really going to find a person who wants to work for you pumping out hundreds of renders a week and not making the money that you make when you're making the whole game. And so it's just not, and on top of it all too, sharing the library of assets is a huge pain. We do it between the two of us because I do renders and you do animations, and we have a server in home that shares our library because you need the entire library in order to work on the same scenes. And I know that there are people that share libraries and work with somebody remotely, but that again, that's a whole logistical nightmare that like would just add so much more time. And then on top of it, with A Shot in the Dark, like I'm the writer and I'm also the artist. And so I know exactly what the scene looks like, and I don't have to spend any time communicating that to myself. Even just the time that we take for me to explain to you what I want for animations, like I can extrapolate out and see how much time I would have to spend explaining to somebody else what I wanted from the 3D renders. And yeah, they would never look like my vision because I'm not going to nitpick them to death. So that's just the reality too, is that it would be a totally different experience hiring out the art. Certainly, I don't think there would be any time saving. And the only potential gain would be if we found somebody that was a better like DAZ artist than me. But again, they're not that common. So I think that'd be a big ask.
I think the other thing that I would consider, if the price is right, I would be willing to hire an animator for A Shot in the Dark if they were like very good quality, because one thing that we've learned over time is that the animations for these games, whether they're 2D or 3D, they're a huge draw for potential fans to come and play your game, because visually speaking, like they're just amazing to see when you see that, because there's not a ton of games out there that do them extremely well.
Right. But along those lines, we have reached out to some DAZ animators and so far haven't found the right person in that regard, in that like it's not even about the price being right at this point, because we certainly have the financial resources, but most quality animators want to work in Blender, and we're not interested in porting our assets to Blender because you lose quality, and it's a whole thing. It's just there's no simple solution to this. If it were as simple as like, hey, let's find a great DAZ animator that we can easily share our library with, and he can just animate exactly what we want very easily. Like if that person existed, I think we would have hired them already, but I don't think that person exists. I think that's the reality.
I think another big aspect with that too is like the extremely good, for example, DAZ animators and Blender animators. Typically speaking, unless they just honestly don't want to be coming up with the ideas themselves, they can make a lot more money on their own, with their own Patreon page, with their own games. They don't need anybody else unless they want them. So for more context in this topic of hiring people out, in the past 2 years, we've tried to hire almost everything out. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. If you don't know this already, like I'm a huge optimist. and I think that it's going to work out. I hope it's going to work out until it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, I go through a grief period. And that grief period is hard for me. But, each time that it happens, my skin grows a little thicker and I wisen up a little bit more. And I'm like, okay, I can't do this. I can't tie myself to this hope. One of my ambitious hopes was that eventually we'd hire everything out and we'd have a well-oiled machine. It'd be efficient. And maybe even we would have like a team captain or something who would manage our team members, and we would just literally be behind the scenes and just pipe in for like project management. Like, we want to see these scenes or this thing happens in the story. The reality is that's an extremely tough and unrealistic goal. Anybody who does accomplish that with a full team, more power to them. I'm sure it has its struggles. I'm sure that, it took a lot to get to that point, and, God bless, because that ain't us.
Yeah.
I will say some of the recent successful stuff that we've hired out for specialized tasks, which have worked out nicely for us, these discrete tasks that we want finished, that don't have anything that is after that, are translation and localization, like the staging of that for both games in general, and then, creating an automated process, essentially, for a shot in the dark with Crowdin. That was something that we hired out, and we're hopeful that it's going to deliver, and we're very excited about that. Another thing is upgrading to Ren'Py 8. We would not have done this if it were just going to be us, because I don't want to deal, like on the coding side of things, with all the potential issues that spring up with that, because we're already taxed with all the content creation we have to do for these games. I don't want to spend any more time on technical difficulties unless I have to with bug reports. Another thing that turned out very nicely for Prince of Suburbia is hiring out custom GUI. I absolutely despise working on GUI, especially in Ren'Py. So being able to find somebody who was able to do that and implement what we were looking for was absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. Highly recommend it if you can find somebody who can deliver that for you.
I just want to clarify too, though, with all of these things, the person that ended up actually achieving all these goals was not the first person that we worked with. I think for all of these things, we worked with like at least two people, or at least, especially with GUI, like we worked fully with two people and got fully into the actual like creation and implementation of GUI with two people. That did not work out. So that's the part too that you don't see, which is that, it wasn't just, oh great, we hired somebody and they made GUI. Like, we had two completely failed attempts where we got like halfway through the process before it fell apart. And so that was a lot of time that was lost before we got to the person that was actually able to do it.
Yeah, honestly, for the GUI side of things, it's not that the first person or the couple people before that didn't necessarily work out. It's that it was inexperience, certainly on my end as a business owner in this industry for Ren'Py games, as in I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I didn't know that the option existed that you could hire somebody who would also implement if you paid them enough to do it. Originally, we ended up getting just strictly graphical assets to plug into Ren'Py. And anybody who's done coding in Ren'Py, especially GUI-related stuff, like unless you love the hierarchy of how that stuff works with styling and all that kind of stuff, good luck, because you're going to be so frustrated by the end of that process. You're probably going to want to take a month off before you actually start delivering on content again. Also, a discrete task that we're hiring out, a future task, is the Steam Deck verified. We're looking for somebody who can optimize our games to run on Steam Deck and get that fancy little green check mark for both games. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be a huge payoff, but it's going to be great that we, once again, offer the game to as many people as possible. And it's no secret in my mind, especially with as many Android players that we have, that people like to play these kind of games in a more accessible way too. Not necessarily at their PC or whatever that is. Something that's more mobile that they can take other places.
Yeah, I think all these tasks for me are things that, they're not necessarily about like increasing ROI or anything like that. It's just that like we do have the funds, and as long as we can find somebody to do these things, they increase the quality of the game and they make it accessible to more players. And to me, they're just, they're a good use of reinvesting funds into the games to make them better. And they don't necessarily have to achieve any specific goal. Like it's just like a nice thing that we can do for players because they've supported us financially. And so, we're always looking for things that we can do to make the game better for players.
And I've also talked about this with the programmer that we do have working on the Steam Deck verified thing and the crowd-in translation stuff. Like the Steam Deck verified, like optimizing for Steam Deck, it's just honestly also super cool. Right. Like to be able to have a game like that on Steam Deck, and as a developer putting that out, it's an achievement that is on a lot of people's bucket lists, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And to know that we are going to have a lot of people playing that, it's just amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely, these are all, I think, for us, kind of like morale boosters. Like it feels like it's a nice way to give back to the community. And it's just a cool thing to do, and you feel good when you've achieved it.
Another reality is, even when you do find the right people, or the people who stick around and they contribute to your projects. The honest truth is, because you are managing people, it takes a lot of extra time, and it is going to slow down development. Like we mentioned before, it helps you release a more polished product, and just like we said, with the tasks that were successful, it's definitely going to make it more polished and more accessible. But it definitely took a lot of time, and it is still going to take a lot more time to complete.
Yeah. And because we do most of the content creation, that takes time away from content creation, and that's just the reality of it. Something too, I find that I just realized this too, in both the case of the upgrading to RenPy 8 translation and Steam optimization person, and then also our GUI person, we found both of those people they were working on safe for work visual novels. And so I think that's something else too that we've learned, is that like it's the pool of people that are specifically looking for jobs in the adult industry is like really small. And, sometimes we have to like reach out and kind of bring them in, which can be hard because a lot of people don't necessarily want to work on adult content, but that safe for work visual novel world is kind of like that bridge between them, because they're familiar with RenPy, they're familiar with visual novels, but, they haven't necessarily like taken that leap into working for adult content. And so, and we've had a lot of luck bringing people over from that world and finding good talent that way. We've had luck hiring out specialized business tasks as well. We hired a lawyer to prepare and file our paperwork for becoming an LLC. I remember him being like, this is really boring. Like, you guys could do this yourselves. And we were like, but we don't want to do it ourselves because we have the money, and having somebody else do it who's an expert means that we don't have to spend development time figuring out how to do it. And we have the peace of mind that it was done correctly. So when we do hire out experts for those kinds of things, like our business is very simple from a business standpoint. A lot of times I think they kind of look at us like, well, why are you even hiring me? Like, you could technically do this yourself. But again, we have the funds. And so if it saves us time and like stress to have somebody else handle it, we're always happy to have somebody else handle that. One that was kind of surprising though, is that we wanted to hire a CPA this year to help us become an S Corp. And it was really surprisingly hard to find that, because we don't need accounting services, because again, our business is super simple, and I worked in accounting, so I can keep our books, and our books are extremely simple. We have like only a handful of transactions every month. It's extremely simple. And so we just don't need bookkeeping services. We just need somebody to do like the taxes and the S Corp like part of it. And, there's just a lot of like, not a lot of people that are interested in doing just that one piece of it, because it is a very small piece. And so they can obviously make more money by offering like a more like comprehensive service. So it took a while to find somebody that was interested in just doing the S Corp / tax services for us. On top of that, once again, story of our lives, we had a false start where we started working with a CPA and we're having meetings and things like that and preparing to work with them. And then they found out we made adult content and didn't want to work with us anymore. So you're like, oh my God, like it took us so many months to find that person. Now we have to start again from zero. Like that is just the story of our life this year, is that, as much as we've had success hiring things out and having it work out, like the number of failed attempts that it took to get to that point, like, was it even worth it at that point? Like we lost so much time. But right now we have a lawyer and a CPA both that we like, and fingers crossed they will continue to work out for us as we need things.
So on to the next part here. We've definitely attempted to hire out some more like generalized tasks like social media, content creation, marketing and promotion. Ultimately, those haven't panned out yet. That being said, it's not to say that they can't pan out, and I do think that they could. We've seen glimpses of success on that end. So far, the issue we've had on that front is mostly what I would imagine like life circumstances. For whatever reason, it just didn't pan out. Another aspect to this is finding reliable people who do high quality work can take weeks, if not months, like of investment to find these people. That includes like coming up with the requirements that you have for people to come in. This gets fine-tuned each time we go through this, like what we want to add to it to make sure and try to avoid mistakes from last time, that kind of thing.
And as you said before too, something that we've learned as business owners is that we get better results when we're more specific, and that's like a duh. But again, the time that it takes for us to really nail down what we want and get really specific about what we want, like that's a lot of time and effort too. So it's just one of those things where it's like, something else that I've thought about too is that the things that we've had the most success hiring out are things where somebody is like an expert in that specific thing. Like if they're an expert in RenPy and they know even more about RenPy than you do, like that's a pretty rare thing to find. But then, yeah, they're going to actually be able to help you. The problem I think that we've started to run into in this industry too is that we've been around since 2017. We've been doing this full time for 2+ years. We are the experts, and there's very few people that know more than we do or even know as much as we do. And the people that do are fellow game developers. Like they're not people that we can hire. And so anytime we bring somebody on, they typically know far less than us. And therefore we have to invest a lot of time in like training them and making our expectations clear and thinking about what we want, because there's not necessarily a template that we can look at. Like a lot of times we're doing things and we don't see anybody else in the industry doing it. And so we have to figure it out as we go along. And yeah, we get better each time. But yeah, the amount of time that we've invested in like writing down the things that we want and thinking them through, again, I just didn't anticipate how much time and effort can go into that. And I think it, again, speaks volumes that the things that we've successfully hired out are things like a lawyer and a CPA, like things where they're already an expert in their field. But when it comes to things like promotion and marketing, the skills required to do promotion and marketing in the adult game industry and community management and all these things, they're so specific in the adult gaming world that the skills from other industries don't transfer. Like you cannot do community management and promotion and marketing the same way for our games as you do for like indie games or AAA games. And so again, there's just no way we can bring in somebody that already knows what they're doing. Anytime we bring somebody in, we're having to invest a lot of time in training and explaining things. And eventually, like you said, you get to the point where like, is it even worth it to invest this time anymore? Because if they only stick around for a month or two, like then we're back where we started and we're having to invest all that time in somebody new. Yeah, the strategies are just totally different. And even something like we were talking about, like in theory, we'd love to hire somebody for community management, but again, the way that community management works in an industry that's so restricted by being NSFW is totally different than in the safe for work world. And so we just haven't found somebody that already has the skills, and we haven't successfully found somebody that we've been able to train either. So it's, yeah, like again, it's possible that that person is out there, but it's certainly not as simple as I see a lot of players kind of present it like, oh, well, when you just need discrete tasks done, like coding or this or that, they should just hire somebody. And it's like, okay, but there's really only like a handful of people in the whole world that know Ren'Py, you know, and most of them are already making their own games. Like it's just not a very large talent pool to draw from. And so yeah, it's just not that simple as like, oh, just find somebody and tell them to do it, because it's a very specific skill set to work in adult games.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect too is, as you've already mentioned, some of the best tasks that we've completed recently, the discrete tasks, have been from the actual developer, like non-adult game developer areas of the community. And I think a big part of that has to be factored in is the Western adult game visual novel market, for example, is still very much in its infancy, in my opinion, whereas the non-adult visual novel type games have been around for a considerable amount of time long in comparison to the adult games.
Yeah, and I think that gets into another like struggle that we run into, which is that I'm sure in a lot of people's eyes, we are not like we are not a reliable employer. I think if you ask anybody that's worked for us, they will tell you that we are extremely professional and reliable, that we always come through as promised, if not are more generous than we promised to be. But, you know, for some random person that's just meeting us for the first time, they have no way of verifying, like, are we actually going to come through with our promises? And this industry is extremely like anonymous. Like most of our team members, we don't even know their real names. A lot of them live in other countries. Like there's no contract. Like it's a very like loosey-goosey industry to begin with. And so trying to bring in people that aren't familiar with that can feel very scary. Like they don't want to work with us because it seems like this is a very fly-by-night industry, which it probably is potentially for other developers or whatever. But, you know, we know that we're reliable, but of course it's hard to sell that. You know, all these things just make the market for talent even smaller. On top of it, we cannot advertise for jobs on a lot of traditional platforms because they don't want you linking or talking about anything that's related to adult content. So there's just tons of restrictions on how we're able to find people. And all of that leads to it just being like an extremely small talent pool. And so trying to find the right people in that very small pool is far more challenging, I think, than any other industry.
Right. And as you were saying, you know, like with the CPA, they weren't comfortable once they found out we were working with adult content. That goes along the same lines with what we already mentioned, which is if the people that you're trying to hire, like if their kinks and fetishes don't align with what you're offering, or if they're not simply neutral with it, you're going to have issues if that's not addressed or if it's not brought up. It's just the nature of the business.
Yeah, we've certainly had that with writers. And we've gotten to the point now that when we ask people to work with us, we list that straight out. Like, here's all the kinks and fetishes in our games, and we make sure they have no hard limits. Because, yeah, even if they're just working on coding or something, if they have like a fundamental value difference with one of the kinks in our game, like they're not going to want to code for a game and work for a game and support a game that is like directly in conflict with their personal beliefs. And so, you know, that's something that I think a lot of players just don't consider. If they're playing the game and they like the kinks, it doesn't occur to them that there's a large part of the population that isn't comfortable with those kinks, who wouldn't even want to be associated with it. To the point too that also, like, our developer that's working on a lot of the things we talked about, he doesn't want to be identified. He doesn't want anything to like reveal who he is, because he doesn't want his reputation in the industry to be associated with our games, which we totally respect. But it just further proves that like the people that really have like a lot of talent and are really really reliable don't really want to necessarily be associated with our type of content.
Some other factors that you have to contend with are that, there's a lot of people in the industry that live in other countries. So payments and that kind of thing can be somewhat tricky. Another aspect is, we're not a AAA or AA game studio. So we don't have the kind of funds or the kind of setup right now to be able to hire real employees, can't offer health and retirement benefits. Whereas if you consider that there's other studios in the world where the amount of money they can make from these kind of games is enough to actually provide like full-time wages and health insurance, all those benefits to their employees, that they're actually able to scale up and people are satisfied. And that's just a reality of the situation. And, to be clear, I don't fault anybody that we have hired where we weren't meeting, their financial goals for them working with us. It's just the reality of the situation is that we're in a very expensive part of the world. And as of right now, we don't have the funds to reach that kind of level.
Yeah, I think, that's the reality too. Like we said before, these games have a low floor. I do think it's relatively easy to become successful with these games compared to making other types of games. Making all types of games is hard. So, the easiness is definitely relative here. If it were truly easy, everybody would be doing it. But certainly, it doesn't appear to me that it would be easier for us to be making money with indie games with the amount of work that we're putting in. However, the ceiling is extremely low. And that's why you do not see any AAA studios making games in this space, but you don't really even see hardly any indie studios. And the studios that do exist that have, more than 10 or 15 people are all in other countries where the cost of living is much lower. Because the reality is there's definitely a ceiling on these games of like a few million. And that's just like not enough money for basically any video game to be worth making, especially when you have lots of people working on it. So, and we're not anywhere near that level either. So, certainly like as much as, we've reached some of our financial goals faster than we anticipated, we are certainly not at the level that we can hire full-time employees. And that kind of middle space that we're in where we want to hire people, but we can't hire full-time employees, like that's just a really difficult space to be in. And I don't know, maybe that's a difficult space for all small businesses to be in, but we just don't know because we don't have that experience. Yeah, I think the thing that we've learned is that finding people takes a lot of time. And, sometimes we never find the right person despite our best efforts. When we do find the right people, there's definitely like a time and emotional investment cost that comes with working with other people. Even when things work out great, like it's still, there's still just a lot of time that's lost in terms of communication and, waiting on them to get things done. And that's just the reality is that even when we find the right person and, we're compensating them at a level that they seem happy with and everything seems great, it's still been our experience that it's really hard to keep people around long term for, a lot of reasons that again are very understandable. Again, we're not hiring them as a full-time employee, even if we're compensating them well for the work that they are doing. So, they probably have a full-time job or other jobs that they're doing and they have a family and they have other priorities. And yeah, we're probably lowest on the totem pole as we should be. And we definitely don't fault them for that. But of course, when life gets in the way, what's the thing that they're going to drop? Well, it's the thing that's lowest on the totem pole, and that's us. And so we certainly understand that even with the people that we love working with and have done a great job, and we would happily, continue to pay them as much as we're paying them or more for the work that they're doing, like they're just not interested in continuing because no amount of money is going to make it worth it to them when they have other life priorities. It's a side hustle for basically everybody that we work with. And, we respect that like this is our full-time job, but for them, it's just a side hustle. So our priorities are just never going to be aligned in that way. And yeah, as you mentioned before, like it's just not the same working on somebody else's project as it is working for your own project. And when it comes to creative endeavors like content creation, like art and writing, and even coding to an extent is a creative and artistic endeavor. It is not just purely a robotic, ones and zeros output kind of thing. There's definitely a lot of thought and that goes into implementing code as far as like realizing a specific vision. And so we've just found with all those content creation tasks that, yeah, people just can't sustain the passion necessary to work on our games for years at a time, which makes sense because who could do that? Most developers struggle to maintain stamina working on games for years at a time. That's why you see so many first releases and maybe a second release and then they abandon it because this shit is fucking hard. So why would we expect anybody to do it for us? Like that's really what it comes down to is, that's a hard reality, I think, for players to face because they want to imagine that the more money we make, the more we can hire out and the faster we can go. But the reality is like, there is no amount of money that's going to make people want to do this shit for us. because this shit is fucking hard. And, that's just the unfortunate reality that we've been having to come to terms with this year, which is that, even when you find the right people, they're just not going to stick around forever, because if they're really, really good, then eventually they're just going to want to do their own thing in one way or another. And we love that. We love to see the people that we've worked with go on to do bigger and better things. Like, we love to be a launching pad for people, even though that can hurt and it can be hard as far as like, it's hard to see people go and we miss them. But, certainly, like the Omega said, we're always happy for people. That's what we want for them. But from a business standpoint, that turnover is really hard. So all of this to say that, like, in 2022, last year, we were doing the majority of the content creation except for the 2D art. But we were doing like 99% of the rest of it. I think we might have hired a few writers like later in the year, but they were writing like a handful of scenes each. It was not something that we had really started scaling up yet because we just didn't have the funds. Yeah, development went a lot faster when it was just basically the two of us working on it. And then this year, I feel like we were working just as hard, if not harder, and we got so much less done. And it's really depressing to think about that. And it's like hard to admit that to the players, which is like, I think we had the best of intentions. Like, we really wanted to speed up development. We wanted to scale. We wanted to do what, businesses are supposed to do. And it just didn't work. And maybe that's our own fault. Maybe we just didn't do things the right way. Maybe we needed more experience. But like you said, I'm kind of at the point now where it's like, I just want to go back to how things were last year, where we were doing the majority of the work ourselves. Like, that was, parts of it can be tedious. There can be parts of the work that we don't like. But I think now, at least for me, like, having compared those two experiences, the experience of trying to hire out those tasks is much less enjoyable than just powering through them. And so, which is not to say that like some other developer that, we could probably stick with it. And I'm sure other developers do. And they're able to successfully hire out a team that works really well together and is like a well-oiled machine like we always anticipated or wanted. But I just don't know that that's us. Like, I don't know that we're those people. And I do think we were happier and therefore, and also more productive when it was just the two of us. And, I think we thought maybe the grass was greener. And now that we've experienced it, like, we realized the grass was always greener on the original side. So yeah, that's, as you said, that's kind of our plan for next year and for the next game, is really to pivot and like kind of do like a 180 and say like, instead of trying to like work ourselves into project manager roles, like we actually like game development more than we like project management. And so while that doesn't mean that we're never going to hire anything out ever again, our focus is certainly going to, I think, return more to content creation and less on hiring out. And, while we still may hire out and we definitely will look for opportunities to do so, it's not something that we're going to be like going out of our way to do. And it's not part of our long-term plan anymore to become project managers as opposed to just making games, which is ultimately, I think, for us, the fun part.
Yeah. So just to piggyback on what you're saying, and I agree, we found that we do find the most happiness when we're mostly focusing on the content creation, not managing other people. As I've already mentioned earlier, like the coding struggles we had, people just ghosting, not meeting deadlines. It was so much easier when I just took it over, even though I really didn't want to because I was in the middle of developing the foundation for Shot in the Dark on the coding backend. Part of the issue with Prince of Persia is, we got caught up in reinvesting the funds and kind of lost the fun, like the excitement about why we were doing it in the first place. So, part of that is we want to stick to the original vision and we want to deliver that experience to the players with passion behind it. And that's what really sells, in my opinion. And I think that's why the game ultimately became so successful, is that's what it's about. It's about having fun. It's about the passion behind it, not taking yourself too seriously. More context about us, like we have semi-fire goals. Like, we want to be able to make this our job. Even if we had to do this like for the rest of our adult lives to make our ends meet, it's much better than working for people we don't want to work for, companies we don't want to work for. I recognize that this is not something that everyone can do. And it's a lofty goal, but if you're able to do it, it is very fulfilling in that sense. And the buck stops with you, but you're also in complete control of what you're going to do to make this happen for yourself. But yeah, ultimately what it boils down to for us is, regardless of whether or not it goes faster or slower, typically speaking, the most enjoyable path is us working together as a team together, hiring out the discrete tasks, keeping the experience as stress-free as possible. Anything that provides a lot of friction is something we're going to avoid again in the future, and we're going to learn from those experiences. So that's one goal we're striving for.
Yeah, the reality is that, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. This is something that takes many, many years to do. And so you really have to plan for the long run and not get sometimes we get lost, I think, in more like short-term goals or what we think we should be doing. And, we take times like this to reflect and to reevaluate what we want our goals to be and to think more long-term about, like, if we're going to be doing this for the next 5 years, do we want to spend the next 5 years managing people, or do we want to spend the next 5 years making games? And the reality is that our answer personally is making games. And, even as we say all this, like, I don't want to promise that just because next year we're going to take, more of a focus on the content creation, that things are suddenly going to go much, much faster. They may or may not, because, part of it too is that we have to take care of ourselves and make sure that we avoid burnout. And even though we enjoy the content creation more than project management, there's still a lot of times that the content creation is just not fun, and it can really burn you out if you're just doing it and grinding it out day after day. And so, we have to make sure we're thinking long term as well about our own like mental health and physical health too, so that, the reality is, I think, from a player perspective, I get it, because I am also a fan of things. I'm a fan of TV shows and books and movies and games. And of course, when a season ends or a book ends or whatever, like, all you're thinking is like, when does the next one come out? And you want it to come out faster. So 100%, I sympathize with players that are just like, when is the next update coming? That means they're excited about it. And that is great. That's what we want. So it's never the answer that people want to hear, that like things are going to take longer than they want, or that they did before, or that the developer expected. But, I think what a lot of players just don't recognize sometimes is that the choice is often between going slower or stopping completely. And certainly there have been moments, as with any long-term project, where you're just like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And, but if you take a little break from it, or you slow down, or you focus on something else, then you're able to come back with, a refreshed outlook, and you're able to continue. If you just try to go full speed, like we've been going for the past 2 years, if we try to do this for the next 5 years, like, we're not going to make it. So that's part of it too, is that, we can cut back some of our expectations. We can, go back to basics a little bit when it comes to content creation, but that doesn't mean that we're going to go faster either, because we have to take care of ourselves. And yeah, the main reason that we wanted to do this as our business is to be able to take back control of our lives from our employers, and to be able to set our own schedule and to focus on our own priorities. We have a kid, we have a family, we have family members around us, we have friends, we have a very rich life outside of our jobs. And, this year we also did take a little bit more time, I think, to travel and to spend time with our daughter. She's getting older every day, and like, she's only going to be a kid for so long. And so, even if it comes at the expense of a few hours of game development, like, of course, we're always going to pick her first. And, I think that's important too for players to recognize, which is, yeah, like, we're human beings too. And so like, we can, like, for us to continue doing this in the long run and to deliver the games that we want to deliver, like, we have to make sure that our lives are balanced and that we don't spend too much time on any like one thing. The reality is, like, money is an infinite resource that you can chase forever. And I think we got a little bit caught up in that, not necessarily chasing money, but like, we had this money. And so we felt like we had to use it in order to like put it back in the games, and we had to do that right away. And I think what we've learned is, like, we need to go a little slower, and like, we will eventually reinvest that money back in the game, but it doesn't have to be like today. It can be next year. It can be years down the road. We don't have to like achieve all of our goals this year. Like, we have time, and, if that means going a little bit more slower, so be it. But like, I think we've proven we can get across the finish line. We've finished a game, and we will finish more games. Sometimes it goes faster, sometimes it goes slower. Like, we're learning lessons every day, and like, you can't buy more time. No amount of money can buy you time. And that's like a lesson that, I feel like we keep learning over and over again. So that's where I think the biggest lesson we've learned this year.
To go along with that kind of stuff, I do believe that burnout is a huge issue especially in this community, the adult game world. There's a lot of developers who reach burnout. They go on hiatus, they disappear, like their pages are completely deleted without any like actual announcement or anything like that, or they just kind of are idle and they don't say much, but they still have everything up, but it's obvious that there's something going on.
Yeah, and I think too, there's a big perception in this industry of like, once solo developers start making more money, that they're now making more money than one person deserves, and therefore they should be hiring out, and that the fans deserve that in order to make development go faster. And so I think that that's definitely, I don't want to speak for you, but that was part of it for me too, is like, we are not greedy people, and we don't we don't do this just for the money, and we're not endlessly chasing like more and more profit. So if we do have more money than than we anticipated. Like I personally feel like, yeah, we do have an obligation to try to, deliver more for the players and to reinvest that in the industry and in the community. And so that's kind of, I guess, disappointing for me as well, is that, we tried to do it in this particular way and it didn't really work out. And I don't really know what the next way is going to look like, but that's still a commitment that I have, which is that, as long as people are financially supporting us, like, we're not going to take more than we need. And we're going to, like, whatever we can do to make our games better or to make the industry better or whatever, like, we want to do those things. It's just that, there's a reason why there's just so many solo developers that never hire things out. Like, I don't think they're all being greedy. Like, that just wouldn't even make sense. I think the much more simple answer is what we've experienced, which is that hiring things out isn't necessarily better, and it can make your life objectively worse if you're unhappy with it. And it takes a lot of time. And so, even if you do have the resources, like, you're not obligated to use those in any particular way, regardless of what, like, the fans in the community might say. Like, your only obligation is to just, continue delivering content at whatever speed and quality is sustainable for you. And that's all we can promise. And we can't promise any more than that. We know we had a lot to say about a question that none of you explicitly asked. It's just, this is a topic that we see discussed a lot amongst players. And obviously, I think it's obvious that this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about. And again, it was something that, we wanted to be able to share with players and be a little bit more vulnerable, admit some of the mistakes that we've made, admit some of the lessons we've learned, and maybe hopefully shed some light and insight on why other developers don't necessarily hire out. And, we don't like the perception in the industry that people that, are making a lot of money and don't hire things out are somehow greedy or, like, milking, or, like, if developers slow down over time, like, they're just milking their community, because the reality is like, no developer can maintain the speed that they had that first year when they're really hungry and they need to develop really fast in order to just, like, make ends meet and, like, support themselves. Nobody can maintain that pace for 5-10 years. So inevitably, yes, as people become more successful, inevitably, yes, they're going to slow down, because that means that they can continue to deliver content as opposed to, like, burning out and quitting completely. And so, for all those reasons, we just felt like we really wanted to speak from the heart about this issue that we've been experiencing this year. Hopefully it sheds some light on why our development has been slower, and maybe it gives you some more sympathy or insight into why other developers have had similar things happen to them. Obviously, we can't speak for other developers, so we're not saying that every developer is in the same situation that we are in, but from having talked to other developers, we do know that a lot of them have faced basically the exact same challenges of trying to use funds to reinvest in the game and hire people out to make things go faster, and ultimately having it make it go slower, regardless of how positive the experience was or not.
So thank you for listening. If you have any questions you'd like us to answer, please reach out. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.